Welcome or welcome back to another episode of Tastie Dine. On today's episode is all about open crumb sourdough bread made from scratch. I'll show you how to do one variation is plain and one is stuffed with garlic and dried tomatoes. So shall we? The backbone of this recipe is an active sourdough starter. And we have a recipe of the sourdough starter on our TikTok page, so check that out. You'll measure out at least 120 grams of the sourdough starter with 310 grams of warm filtered water into the sourdough starter mixture, and then whisk that out until you get a white and a milky consistency such as this. This is when you add 1 teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of icing sugar or granulated sugar if you have, 4 cups of all-purpose flour, but you can also substitute the all-purpose flour with the same amount of bread flour. Now mix that together with your hands until you get a very sticky dough. Then cover the dough with cling wrap and set it aside for 1 hour. 1 hour later is when we start the folding process, and I'm using filtered warm water. So you're going to tuck in your wet hands under the dough, lift it up and fold it over itself in the opposite direction. Rotate the bowl 90 degrees. Repeat the steps 4 times while wetting your hands. Lift and then over itself in the opposite direction. Rotate the bowl 90 degrees. Wet your hands again and do the same repetitive motion. As the repetition of the sourdough folding processes continues, here are some interesting and fun facts about sourdough bread. This will help you have a deeper understanding of its origins, processes, and health benefits surrounding sourdough baking. For instance, sourdough doesn't have to be sour despite its name. While sourdough might make you think that it might be tangy and sour, but that's far from the truth. The name sourdough actually refers to the method of leavening bread with sour dough, which in this case is the sourdough starter. Despite its name, the bread itself doesn't have to be sour, unless of course you want it to. With manipulation of time, temperature, and ratios, you can produce bread with more mellow, interesting flavors. In fact, the more sourdough starter you use, the less time your dough will need to ferment, resulting to a milder flavor. Time and patience is definitely important when it comes to sourdough. Now back to the screen, I am just easily tucking in the ends and the edges of the sourdough folded dough. Covering it up and resting it for 1 hour is very important so the gluten is activated. So set that aside for 1 hour. Then 1 hour later, we repeat the same folding process for at least 4 more times with intervals of 1 hour in between the resting period. So as that proceeds, let's go back to our interesting fun facts. So sourdough starter can be suspended in time. What does this mean? It means or requires constant maintenance if you're keeping it on the counter. This is perhaps one of the most off-putting things that sourdough, and one of the reasons many people never actually start making sourdough culture. Salt is more important in sourdough than just flavor. While many people say that salt isn't really that important in sourdough and just provides the flavor, you might be surprised to know that it actually does a lot more than this. Salt is responsible for helping to build a stronger gluten network, tempering fermentation and preserving the bread. Now, back to the screen, we'll be back with the fun facts. This is hours later, and since we are working with a very hydrated sourdough, we are going to first lightly flour it and divide it into 2 portions. And at this stage, we do not want to overly flour the dough. We are going to work with it while it's very hydrated and sticky. So we are going to just lightly spread it out and adding the topping of choice, which is chopped dried tomatoes and garlic. And feel free to add as much or as little as you want at the center of the lightly spread out dough, folding it from one end to another and meeting them at the center as shown in the video, and using a bench scraper as a very important tool during this process. Lightly dust with flour on the top side, flip it over using the bench scraper and reshape it into a circular ball shape. Try as much as possible to be gentle and firm at the same time without overstretching the dough or tearing it at any given moment. In a small bowl, lightly oil it and transfer the dough onto the bowl. And at this moment is when I realized there were some tears that were created during the reshaping process. So just gently bring that together by pinching the sides towards the center and repeating the process until the dough is satisfying shaped. So cover it with a cling wrap, then place it in the refrigerator for at least 6 to 12 hours. Well, you guessed it, we're repeating the same process with this other piece of dough. One will be stuffed with the tomato and garlic and one will be plain. This is the plain variation. Now, let's go back to the fun, interesting facts about sourdough. We were talking about salt being a responsible or is responsible for helping to build a strong gluten network. Tempering, fermentation, and preserving the bread is the purpose of the salt. While some countries do indeed bake bread without salt, forgetting to add salt in sourdough bread will result in a sticky, weak dough that really doesn't taste good at all. And do you want that? I believe not at all. Another interesting fact about sourdough: it's really hard to kill a sourdough starter. Unless your sourdough starter has visible mold, then you can safely say that it's alive and kicking. The only reason to toss your sourdough starter would be if you can see some fuzzy green mold or harmful pink or orange bacteria. Now back to the screen, as if your eyes weren't on the screen. 6 or 12 hours later, lightly dust your countertop surface and place your dough onto the surface and lightly dust the top part. Gently spread out the dough and fold it as shown in the video, making sure the edges are tucked in firmly to avoid any spillage as shown in the fast folding process. Once done, flip over the dough and reshape it into a tightly knit circular shaped dough. At this point, the dough should not be sticky at any given time. Once you flip it, tightly tuck in the edges and making sure nothing is spilling out, and reshaping it back to its normal round shape. And while you do this, you will notice some air pockets or air bubbles showcasing on the top side of the dough. And this is a very good thing. And you'll get to understand this once we start the baking process. But before then, place a clean kitchen towel on top of a bowl and dust it generously with all-purpose flour and place the dough with the good side facing down. The top side of the dough should be lightly dusted with flour. Cover the dough properly with the edges tucked in as shown in the video, and then place another cling wrap on top of it to tightly cover the bowl. This should be the second refrigeration of the dough for 12 hours. Bring out the other piece of dough from the chiller and repeat the same process as we continue with the interesting fun facts about sourdough. Another key fun fact is that sourdough is not gluten-free. While sourdough is known for its many health benefits and its ability to be tolerated by people with gluten intolerance, it's not actually gluten-free. Sourdough bread contains some gluten, although it is lower in gluten than commercially yeasted bread because the lactic acid bacteria breaks down the gluten during the cold fermentation. Another key point or fun fact is weighing your sourdough ingredients will give you a better chance at sourdough success. What I mean is by using a digital kitchen scale. Another interesting fun fact is that sourdough baking has its own language. What do I mean by this? I mean, if you are new to sourdough baking, it might sound like we are speaking a whole other language. Words like bulk fermentation, cold retard, autolyse, and alveoli will make your way into your everyday thoughts once you start baking sourdough bread. This is day 3. 12 hours later, we are checking up on our dough and prepping it for baking. Lightly dust with all-purpose flour, place a parchment paper over and flip the bowl just as shown in the video. Lightly and gently peel off the kitchen towel, then dust the top side with all-purpose flour. Then score using a very sharp razor blade. Using a simple pattern or a single slash will do. Sourdough bread is scored to allow gas to escape from the bread in a controlled way. If you do not score sourdough, it will break open at the weakest point. So you have to use a very sharp blade to help with that. For the past 1 hour, our heavy-duty chapati pan has been preheating in the oven at 240 degrees Celsius. So take it out from the oven, place your dough and cover it up with a heavy duty oven-proof bowl. First, bake it for 20 minutes covered and then remove the bowl. And this is how it should look like once you remove the bowl. Then bake it for another 20 minutes. Now this is hours later when the bread has cooled down completely is when we can check it out and slice it through. And this is our outcome for the sourdough bread in 2 variations. So let's slice it through and see what variations we have. So there are 2 terms when we talk about language in sourdough bread baking. We have the open crumb and we have the closed crumb. Both refer to the structure and texture of the interior of a sourdough baked bread, particularly in relation to the distribution and size of air pockets.